Hi, Jason. What's the weather like in London?
Well, Martin, it's the UK, so of course it's raining outside. How about you? How's your weather in California?
I've had the curtains drawn all day because I'm recording videos, so I really don't know. But today we're talking about how to coordinate microservices. Is it better to have a central coordinator, orchestration, or is it better for control to be distributed among the services, choreography?
Well, with so many things in life, it depends. I'd be happy to share what I've learned from a recent large project.
Thanks for joining me on the show, Jason. You're a freelance Google Cloud architect at 418.dev.
Yes, that's right. I'm also a Google developers expert for both Firebase and Google Cloud Platform, and I run the Google Developer Group in Milton Keynes, which is just outside London.
Nice. I love Google developer groups. They're great places for meeting other developers and learning from each other. Now, you're helping a parking company in the UK build their system on top of Google Cloud Platform, right?
Yes, the company collects vehicle movement and parking permit data from car parks and motorway services.
Okay. And what is that data used for?
They use the data with serverless Google Cloud products to provide analytics and metrics to their customers. The data can also be used for parking enforcement.
Oh, you mentioned serverless. I love that stuff. Why did they pick serverless?
They're using serverless so they can focus their engineering hours on new feature development and to minimize the operations work for their running systems.
Got it. Now, there are two ways of coordinating microservices. Orchestration, a central coordinator calls all the microservices in the right order. Or choreography, microservices send and receive events and act on them, so control is distributed. Which one did you pick for the parking company, Jason?
Well, each one has particular strengths and weaknesses, so we used both.
Tell me more about that.
Well, for example, when a car enters a parking lot, a camera takes a picture of their license plate. The picture of the vehicle going in gets matched with the picture of the vehicle going out, and that matched visit then gets linked to one or more parking permits.
That sounds kind of complicated.
Yes, and to make it simpler, we have multiple services, each one doing part of the work. So, for example, we've got one service which ingests the data from the cameras and passes it through the visit matching service. Then another one which ingests the permit data and matches it with the visits.
Got it. Now, how do you coordinate these services? I imagine the camera ingestion service needs to let the matching service know that a vehicle has entered or exited.
But we use orchestration, where a central controller calls a series of services in a pipeline and returns a result.
Okay, that sounds pretty straightforward. It's nice to have control of the business logic in one place, right?
Yes, but sometimes that isn't optimal. We are using a NoSQL document database that is optimized for reads, so we can sometimes need to denormalize data. For example, an administrator may update the expiry date for a whole group of parking permits. If the expiry date has been extended, a visit that was beyond the expiry date may now be within it, so the driver shouldn't have to pay a parking penalty charge.
Everyone hates paying parking penalties, especially if their permit was just extended. Now, how do you prevent that?
When the permit group is updated, we trigger updates of all the permits in that group. This, in turn, means that we have to match the permits against the visits again.
Okay, but why can't you use a central coordinator for this?
If we only want to change the expiry date of one permit, we don't need to update any other permits. We only need to trigger the visit matching again. A central coordinator will become very complex if it should be able to handle both updates to many permits and updates just to individual permits.
Ah, I see. So if you don't use orchestration, what do you use instead?
Then we use the other method, choreography, where each service receives messages, takes action on those messages, and sends new messages to the other services.
So in what situations do you pick orchestration and when do you pick choreography instead?
When the process is always the same, orchestration shines. For example, when a car enters, we always save the raw camera data. The data is transformed from each camera's manufacturer's proprietary format to our standard data format, and then we extract the images from that and save them into Google Cloud Storage. Finally, we send the event data to Cloud PubSub for processing further down the pipeline.
That makes sense. And when do you use choreography?
When we have services which may form part of a workflow, but may also be triggered individually. A good example is the permit group scenario we talked about earlier.
Got it. Now, it sounds like choreography is based on having many triggers. Isn't it messy to have lots of triggers all over the system? How do you manage that complexity?
If you're using Cloud Functions or Cloud Run services directly in Google Cloud, it's really essential to maintain good documentation and use a tool like Deployment Manager or Terraform to deploy them. However, if you're using the Firebase suite, it's much easier to develop, test, and deploy your Cloud Functions. There's even a great local emulator.
Okay, does that mean that you prefer to use Cloud Functions for Firebase all the time?
Cloud Functions for Firebase only support Node.js and TypeScript, which is great for web developers. But if your team uses another language, such as Go or Python, it may not be such a great fit.
Got it. And which Google product do you recommend for orchestration and for choreography, respectively?
For orchestration, Workflows is a great product for designing orchestration pipelines. Workflows can be triggered by other services such as Cloud Functions, Cloud Run, or Cloud Scheduler. For choreography, you can use EventArc to trigger individual Cloud Run or Cloud Function services based on individual events. However, there are some services like Cloud Firestore and Cloud Storage which can trigger Cloud Functions directly without EventArc whenever an event happens.
Okay, and to recap, when would you recommend using orchestration versus a choreography architecture?
If you're developing a traditional N-tier system on Google Cloud, it's probably best to use the orchestration model. However, if you're building a user interface focused application with something like the Firebase suite, this is where choreography works really well. However, there may be times that you need to create a hybrid app, in which case you can leverage the best of both worlds.
The best of both worlds? I like that. Thank you for joining me and sharing your real world experience, Jason.
Happy to do it.
And thank you everyone for watching. If you have any questions for Jason or me, add a comment below. Also, let me know if there are other serverless topics you'd like to see in future episodes. Bye for now.